everybody. This is Stefani Rupert. Thank you for tuning into the Naked Humanity podcast, where we take the deepest look possible at what it means to be human. Today is episode number 36, and I have on Siobhan Senier, who is a specialist in Native American literature, in sustainability, in women's issues, in a whole lot of things at the University of New Hampshire. So I just finished my call with Siobhan, and it was extraordinary. It was quite deep and wide-ranging, and I actually learned quite a bit. I took notes. I had some ideas for articles I want to write and research I want to do, precisely because we were sort of talking about at this intersection of culture and how it impacts us and our relationship with one another and with our environments. I know that sounds very abstract, but it's very, very important. And Siobhan has a lot of, I think, very insightful things to say about how, from the Native perspective, that sort of reflects unique things about our culture that need to be addressed, right? And so we talk about sustainability, and we talk about something she calls negligibility, and all of these different things where we're disconnected from each other and from the environment, and don't really care about things and don't enact rituals the way humans have for many, many, many thousands of years. And it results in loss and a lot of actually quite negative things, I think, in terms of our short attention spans and our distractibility and our anxieties and instabilities and all sorts of things that I'm constantly talking about as here. So it's, it's quite important, and I'm so honored. I work very hard, and I will say this later too. I work very hard on the podcast to always be having conversations that are intellectually rigorous and also fascinating, and also in touch with a wide variety of cultures and perspectives. And so I try really hard to have gender balance. That's really, it's a challenge. I try really hard to get into discourses that I'm not often a part of, about Black culture and about Native culture and Indigenous cultures and all these sorts of things. And hopefully, again, all of them sort of helping us get at this fundamental question of who we are, what our world is like, what we are doing about it, what we can be doing about it, and that sort of thing. So I think it's all really quite important. I mean, that's why I'm doing it, but it's all really quite important. And this conversation is great, and I want to get right into it. So I'll read you a little bit about Siobhan. She has a bachelor's in English from Bowdoin, a master's in English, and a PhD in American literature, both at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And she is now, as I mentioned, at the University of New Hampshire. She works in the literature department, and she teaches both Native American literature and women's studies. She works in sustainability as well. And also, I think, quite excitingly for me, she is the editor of a massive anthology of Native literature from the New England area called Dawnland Voices, that I really love and will link to in the show notes. And also Dawnland Voices, Google it, has a ongoing blog and website that's rich in materials that can sort of open up your world of reading that's from this culture and this genre that we here, quote unquote, in the West never engage, but can be really helpful for understanding the limits that we impose ourselves by only living within one culture. So I so much do really recommend checking out all of those things. And thank you so much for tuning in. So I promise this will be an engaging and edifying episode. So let's get to it. Here we are, Dr. Siobhan Senier. Okay. Hi. Welcome, Siobhan.
Hi,
welcome. I try not to talk about the weather when I bring on a guest, but are you located in New Hampshire?
Yes, I am.
Yeah,
it is still very cold.
Yes, I did my undergrad at Dartmouth, and so
okay.
I happen to love it, and I do like to check in on how the weather is going whenever I talk to somebody who's in the area. So
we're having a rare morning of sun.
Okay, I'm sorry I'm keeping you inside.
But you're used to that at Oxford. So.
Yeah, the rain here is great. That's why everybody here is so productive, because it rains all the time. That's the secret.
Oh, very good.
Okay, so you you specialize in literature in Native cultures in New England, right?
Right.
Okay, so can as a bit of an introduction, can you tell us how you sort of got into that, and what is it about that field that sort of drives you?
Oh, sure. I actually went to graduate school expecting to be a Thomas Hardy scholar.
Okay.
I still love that stuff, those big Victorian lugubrious novels. But when I was in graduate school, I took a class on Native American literature and I got completely hooked. It just played by different rules.
Interesting.
Native American literature didn't think the same way about character or psychological interiority. It wasn't even the same in terms of plot. And it was really, really good. So it kind of changed the way I thought about what constituted aesthetic pleasure. And so I wound up writing a dissertation about Native American women and their protests against U.S. government policies of land allotment in the late 19th century. So very sort of arcane and specialized, but the United States government, in case all your listeners don't know, pursued a policy in the late 19th or into the early 20th centuries of dividing up reservation lands, which were communally held, into individual parcels, 160 acres, to be given to heads of family, male heads of family, in the interest of assimilating everybody and turning them into yeoman farmers. And it was a disaster. The policy was a disaster. Native Americans lost another 2/3 of what remained of their land base at that time, because it just so happened that after you gave 160 acres to every head of family, there was a whole lot left over for immediate sale to white settlers. So, and an interesting thing about Native American literature in that period is that the Native people who were writing and publishing had been through boarding schools off reservation, where they were forced to assimilate, beaten for speaking their languages. And so they tended to write as though they accepted assimilation. There's a scholar named Robert Warrior who has pointed out that late 19th century Native American literature tended not to produce the same kinds of controversies that, say, African American literature at that period did, where you had this sort of big standoff between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. He says that most Native American writers of that period were interested in assimilation. And so I was sort of looking for traces of resistance to that in the work of Native American women writers. Long-winded explanation of the dissertation. And then I wound up getting this job at the University of New Hampshire, first at the University of Maine. My first job was in Farmington, Maine. And I was hired to teach Native American literature. And so I thought I should have a responsibility to teach the Native American literature of this region. And you went to Dartmouth, which was the home of Samson Occam, right? So founded as a Native American school. And the thing I kept getting told was that, well, there is no Native American literature up here, right? Except Samson Occam. People knew about this 18th century minister, Samson Occam, who had been Christianized and worked on the founding of Dartmouth College. And they knew about another 19th century Pequot minister named William Apess, who also wrote sermons. And some protest literature. And then maybe people knew about a guy named Joseph Bruchac, who's a contemporary writer. He's Abenaki, who writes books faster than I can read them. He's just incredibly prolific. But then it was like, okay, there's no Native American literature in New England other than those three. And I knew that was a lie. And I got tired of creating these Xeroxed course packets, that we all had to do back then for our classes. So I thought I should put together an anthology of this writing. And I was trained in a model when I was in graduate school of literary recovery. We find the writers who have been forgotten and we republish them to great acclaim. And so I sort of had this vision, that I'd be going to the archives and searching and discovering all of these Native American writers, which of course, was an inadvisable term when you're talking about a settler scholar working with Native American literature. And I learned really quickly that I wasn't going to find any of this literature without actually talking to Native American people, which is not something I was trained to do. Talking to people isn't necessarily something I even like to do. I was a literary scholar, so I went to do a PhD in literature for a reason. Mm-hmm. But I had to talk to Native American communities, and I found that they had incredibly rich memories of their literary traditions at the tribal level. So, you visit Passamaquoddy people in Maine, and it's a small community of about 2,000, 2,500 people, but they remember who their writers are all the way back to the earliest times. And they keep them. They keep these well-thumbed, sometimes Xeroxed copies of their writers. So that's actually kind of the back door by which I wound up getting into the topic of sustainability. I'm not even really what we call an eco-critic. Eco-critics sort of study what we used to call nature writing or environmental literature or literature about environmental catastrophe. And then they look to scientists and people in other fields to help them answer those questions about how the literature is behaving. I really came to thinking about sustainability as an issue of how communities were taking care of literature. Because you're a philosopher, right? You know that the humanities are always in crisis, and they're especially in crisis now, right? The sky is always falling. Literature is dying. Nobody's reading. Mm-hmm. Nobody cares about making meaning anymore. And what are we going to do to preserve literary history? And it kind of, in the same way that Native American literature initially blew my mind about what I expected about aesthetics and the way literature ought to be and behave, so too did Native American canon formation and canon preservation really change the way I thought about who's responsible for taking care of literature and stewarding literature and teaching literature and promoting literature and protecting it. What does literature really do? So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
That's a thorough answer, which I thoroughly appreciate. There were so many things you said that I found interesting there. I'd like to sort of walk back to the beginning, mm-hmm. stay in literature for a little bit, and then expand. So you mentioned that there are different rules by which this set of literature that you were not discovering, but coming into increased contact with, I suppose, it plays by different rules. And you mentioned thinking about aesthetic pleasure differently. And I am really compelled by these questions for a number of reasons, but one of them is that we sort of walk around with these presumptions that literature or anything should be pleasurable in X, Y, and Z ways. And it really isn't until you encounter something totally, outside that system where you realize that you've actually been inside a system. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about those different rules or the different kinds of pleasure that you sort of noticed you could experience.
Mm-hmm. I distinctly remember the first book that professor in that literature class in grad school assigned was called The Trickster by Paul Braiding, which is actually an ethnographic collection of traditional oral stories about tricksters. And I remember taking that book on a camping trip and just rolling on the ground because I had been caught out, I think, in certain expectations I didn't know I had. I don't think I really signed up for that class thinking, I'm going to get the primordial wisdom of the elders or something. Mm-hmm. But I did not expect stories about Coyote removing his own body parts and ingesting them and farting and, breaking things down and calling the world into being and then also being a total fool. So at the level of plot, it didn't operate like a Thomas Hardy novel, right? At the level of character, it didn't operate like a Thomas Hardy novel, right? There was no sort of mournful interiority, individual psyche, which I love, right? I still love that out of literature, but it wasn't in traditional indigenous literatures. That was not such a concern.
Interesting.
And it's not like traditional psychological interiority is a concern of all Western literature either, right? But it just, the literature was playing with my expectations that I did not know I had about Indigenous literature, and it was also playing with my expectations about literature with a capital L. Mm-hmm. Some of it tended to be very repetitive too. If you think about oral traditions,
right,
it makes sense for an oral tradition to repeat itself a lot. And what ethnographers used to do sometimes in the olden days when they were writing down an oral story was they would edit it to eliminate repetition. Paul Radin's book didn't do that, and some other ethnographers didn't do that. And so it forced me to think about even editing, even the act of editing, and what a text ought to look like on the page versus how a text behaved when it was performed in community.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I've actually done a lot of reading about oral cultures, or like the field of orality. And I don't know how legitimate that is anymore, but I know it was at least a couple decades ago. Sure. For my own personal edification, what do you sort of think of those kinds of contrasts that have been drawn about the way, like, quote unquote, oral literature and oral societies think and collect memories and all of that versus the way that it happens in societies that write everything down?
So the really cool thing, so the old school Walter Ong theory, I think, is that, sort of orality precedes literacy.
Yeah.
I think the presumption of a lot of so-called salvage ethnography at the turn of the century was that we've got to write this stuff down to preserve it. If we don't write it down, it will be lost forever. And the really cool thing that I learned in the process of putting together this written anthology was that oral is actually preserving the literate in many cases. So there are cases where, say, at the Narragansett tribe in Rhode Island, some Narragansett tribal members in the 1930s published their own magazine during a period of revitalization. They only did it for a year and a half. It was a tiny group of people. Almost nobody in that community, or very few people in that community, have copies of the magazine anymore, but every single person in that community remembers the magazine, the Narragansett Dawn. And they even remember the name of the editor. They remember some of the content that was produced. So there's this really curious thing where instead of the oral preceding the literate, there's like these interesting relays now between the oral and the literate where, perhaps Indigenous people in the 1930s wrote down a traditional story for a magazine, not necessarily thinking they were going to preserve it, but as a way of recirculating it. And it continues to recirculate orally a century later. And then a new Narragansett writer takes that same story that's been sort of carried along orally and puts it in a poem or puts it in a sci-fi novel. So the oral and the literate are really talking to each other, I think, more than Walter Ong and his crowd thought about or understood.
Okay, forgive me if I get too hypothetical. Just tell me I'm too hypothetical and stop. Okay.
You're a philosopher, so
I know. I'm sorry. So I'm thinking about the volume. I'm thinking about the modern world and how we have, now with the internet, have billions, right, of texts and documents and pages. And I'm wondering if with a lower volume of cultural artifacts, people tend to revisit them more. But do you think that it's in the world today that we're sort of less attached to certain narratives, or we let them go more quickly because our attention span is so short? Like, how can that provide insights into how we are today? Yeah.
I mean, it's not even, I've thought about this a lot, right? I mean, so these are communities that aren't at scale, right? The way we are. And even in the academy, even if you think about the literary canon, that you were supposed to know when you graduated Dartmouth and you were supposed to be very literate in, was more global and cosmopolitan, and some would say colonial, than a very small scale community oriented canon. So that poses a real problem. That poses some real conundrums, right? For something like literary history. Are we bemoaning So sometimes I wonder, are we spending too much time bemoaning cultural loss, right? Whereas a smaller scale community might be better equipped with a smaller canon to preserve and share and sustain, if we use the concept of sustainability, and sustain that literary heritage. Yeah. I mean, so I work in digital humanities a little bit too. And, in digital humanities, there's great pressure to operate at scale and show that you have a very large corpus of texts, right? That can then in turn be mined for, so much data. And the thing I have found in working with tribal communities on indigenous digital projects is they're not necessarily interested in scanning absolutely everything they have and uploading it to the internet so that it then becomes available. Like they're more interested in carefully curating one text or one object. So maybe it makes us think differently about scale, if that starts to answer your question.
It does. I find that very insightful and interesting. I just, today, there's so many things about the world today where it's like we're trying to return to something that we can't return to. And I like community size, I think is one of those things. We see ourselves, the internet in a way has sort of helped us create these smaller communities or more niche communities. But on the other hand, they're constantly in flux because people can come and go as they please, right? You're not embedded in a local tradition. Right. And so in that sense, I feel that there's less anchoring, and as much as we might long for that stability and that anchoring, I don't see it really happening.
Right.
Sorry, we're just philosophically meandering. So, okay. So let's tie some things together. We were talking about cultures and cultural sustainability. What are there linkages between or are there things we can learn about environmental stability and cultural stability? How do those sort of discourses reflect one another, if they do?
The literature itself I think about stewardship as a fiduciary duty of care, right? To a land, a community, to kinship with other humans and other non-humans, other than humans, and the literature itself. So whereas in the academy, we tend to think about literature with a capital L as something that we analyze in a classroom and appreciate aesthetically, for Indigenous people, at least in the cases I've read, the literature is not so divorced from everyday life and even everyday environmental concerns, so that what's important about a particular poem that's getting recited and remembered over time is in fact the connection to the local place, its shellfish, its waterways, its trees, so that the literature itself is helping the community to steward their particular place, but is also in turn something that is stewarded by the community and by that particular place. So Passamaquoddy people have petroglyphs that are now being marked as a preservation site. And that's sort of interesting to think about, and they had this really cool Passamaquoddy petroglyph project where Passamaquoddy people got a grant to visit these petroglyphs, which are only accessible by canoe, I think. They're on these rocks out in the ocean. And they had this really cool grant to create art around the petroglyphs and write poetry about the petroglyphs and songs about the petroglyphs. And that's something sort of interesting, because the rocks themselves become storytellers, become agents in the stewardship of this literary history and also of this environment, right? I mean, these rocks have survived for a very, very long time, and they're expected to survive for a very, very long time. I don't know if that starts to answer your question.
I think it was not a great question. So it's fine that it's pretty good that it didn't. I find that really interesting in the humanities today. I have spent a fair amount of time in affect theory and the like.
Yeah, yeah.
And a lot of theorists there tend to try to elevate what we might call like agency, tend to elevate the relevance of things we normally don't think of as agents, right? Like rocks and other things, everything in our environment. I don't just mean the natural environment, I mean like things, right? And so I find what you're saying to be really resonant with that. And it's very interesting. Perhaps there is something about our tendency, especially in this specific culture, to like subject object distinct, to sort of make ourselves distinct from the things around us. Whereas I think in probably a lot of other places in the world, there isn't quite the same tendency to separate ourselves from the rest of the world.
Yeah. There's a fascinating article that was written by a Métis woman from Canada named Zoe Todd that gets a lot of circulation. And I can't remember the exact title, but it's something like an Indigenous feminist rant on the so-called ontological turn. And she talks about going to see Bruno Latour talk, and it's the great Bruno Latour, and I'm going to learn all these great things. And his thesis to her winds up feeling like Indigenous people have known this for millennia. Like, why are you telling us that there's no distinction between nature and culture? Why are you telling us that objects and things and other than humans have agency? We have known this for millennia. So that's a sort of emerging discourse in a lot of Indigenous scholarship, is that we've known these things for a long time, and you're taking credit for our ideas without giving us genealogical credit. And
do you think, yes, I think that's very important. Do you think that there's any kind of connection between that already knowing that community has about connectivity and sort of the same kind of wisdom they tend to carry, and we tend to not carry about our relationships with the environment?
I think the short answer to that question is yes.
Is there a long answer?
Tell me more about how you're thinking about the relationship.
Well, I think I have spent a fair amount of time trying to engage discourses where people think in a different, whatever ontological frame, or trying to understand how humans can relate to one another and the environment in a variety of contexts. And so I see potential, right? I see something sort of potential. I also have a close friend who works in Indigenous rights activism in Nepal. He's Nepalese, and he has really influenced my thinking in terms of quote unquote stewardship, right? In terms of the sort of embedded wisdom that the groups that he works with have about how to coexist with the environment. And it's been just intrinsic in their culture for a very long time because it's been very necessary. And they see themselves as deeply embedded in these communities, or as in their environments, right? It's very relational. They have relationships with the plants, relationships with the animals. And that's sort of just very important. And so I do see sort of a link between this ethic of reciprocity or caretaking and the quote unquote metaphysics of what we could call connectivity or something.
Right. The reciprocity principle is so interesting and important, and it points us back to the history of settler colonialism. So there's a really fantastic article by an Aboriginal Australian writer named Alexis Wright, who has written quite a bit about climate change. And she has this article called Deep Weather. And I remember sharing it with a scientist recently. So the article starts by talking about a cyclone that hit the coast of North Queensland in 2011. And then it kind of moves into saying, here we are in the midst of climate change, and you all are freaking out like this is the apocalypse. But indigenous people have already been through the apocalypse, right? So this is not new to us or unique to us. And don't you want to know about the traditional knowledge that we have had for millennia that has kept us alive in this place? And then she ends by saying, basically, you're not going to get it from us. You're not going to get it from us until you reset the button on the relationships between settlers and indigenous people, right? And she ends by talking about treaties. And I remember giving this to a very earnest scientist who's concerned about climate change and wants to write a grant, collaborating with indigenous communities and wants to do the right thing. And she sort of finished this article like, what? But I wanted to know how they survived the cyclone. And that wasn't the purpose of that article, right? The purpose of the article was to reset the relationship between even the colonial reader and the indigenous author.
So she performed the precise irony that was being pointed to.
Right.
Of course.
Right.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think even you're talking about repairing or resetting that relationship. I don't know if it can be repaired. Resetting is better. Resetting that relationship. But even the first step in that would be listening, right? And
of course,
that is, that's not going to happen.
Right.
Not going to happen. Right.
That's another really challenging. Circle back to where we started about questions of aesthetic pleasure. That was another really challenging thing for me about indigenous literature in the beginning, is that I think I was trained as a graduate student to sort of have a thesis, right? To critically unpack the text and to perform my various textual analyses on it and to have a thesis. And the literature was resisting that steadfastly, right? The literature was saying, let it alone, let it be. And that's also challenging. I mean, it's challenging for literary scholars. It's challenging for any human being, I think, in a communicative interaction.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, and this is maybe getting us a little farther afield, but I am consistently enraged by the performativity of our academic discourses, right? As opposed to, well, it's very hard. We almost need to invent things to say in order to stay relevant, whereas this literature, which exists and which moves through people in important ways, and sure, maybe we can analyze it. However, that's the important stuff, and maybe we could just be pointing to it. I sort of see us in the academy as aggregating all of these critical discourses, and then okay, what are you doing with them?
Right. What's your intervention?
Exactly. And you can even publish articles in journals about intervention all day long, but you're still not intervening, which I think is interesting. I'm trying to intervene, but I don't know. It's going to take me a while. It's going to take me a while. Okay. So, sustainability. We know that we live in a uniquely, we've sort of been talking around this, but we know that we live in a uniquely sort of unsustainable world. Can you maybe talk a little bit about your or a Native perspective on why the world that we live in today, the whatever modern West, quote unquote, that we live in today is so unsustainable? Or is there writing in your literature that sort of reflects on this or can refract on it?
I mean, it all actually points back to capitalism and colonialism, right? I mean, from an indigenous perspective, probably the answer is quite simple. Right. It's capitalism and colonialism have put us in this pickle. And capitalism and colonialism, I mean, this has been many, many centuries of an extractive economy, right? Extractive economies that were designed to take things from the earth and from other humans, other human beings and other non-human beings, not only for survival, but for profit. Again, there's a growing body of indigenous literature that says that from their perspective, this is not necessarily unique. It shows up even on indigenous Twitter, right? That we've already been through the apocalypse. Y'all are, very upset about climate change, but you're right. I mean, on a certain level, there's no gainsaying that what's happening at the level of planetary crisis feels really new and feels really unique. I forget where this question started.
Unsustainability and sort of I don't know if it's like an addiction to excess or power, and I'm using addiction very loosely, of course, but an attachment to, these sort of maybe power is it, or being so used to not having to make sacrifices for your relationality. Like it people are like, oh my goodness, I would have to walk to the end of the hallway to recycle. Like I live with people who are like that. I always have. The recycling bins are at the end of the hallway, so nobody does it. But if you put it in front of them, they'll do it, right? And we have to work very hard to try to trick each other in this world today, or to make it easy. We have to make everything easy, which I find very interesting, because I think often in more sustainable local native cultures, what have you, this reciprocity is deeply embedded in the culture and really important, but it's not necessarily always easy, but people still do it.
Right. And they also have ways of connecting themselves meaningfully. If we think about your field and mine as places where we figure out how human beings make meaning of things and feel connected. Mm-hmm. So some of the climate scientists that your friend Megan and I got to know are people, at my university who feel like we've got all our data. We've got really good data. We know what is going on here. And they're turning to humanities scholars saying, help us understand why human beings don't want to walk to the end of the hall to recycle. Help us understand how to help humans make meaning. There's a philosopher we invited, maybe for show notes later, we can look this up, and I'm forgetting her name, but we invited a philosopher to talk about this very problem at my university. And she had this coinage that I thought was very beguiling. It was called negligibility, right? That people in today's fast-paced society, quote unquote, are so used to imagining things at such a global scale that it actually feels like it doesn't matter much whether I walk to the end of the hall and put the can in the recycling bin. And, guess what? Now I've just learned that all of my recycling is contaminated and tainted anyway, so I've been putting it in these bins for years, and it just wound up in a landfill anyway. That that human beings don't have a sense that their individual actions matter very much. And probably, again, to return to the idea of smaller scale indigenous communities who have routine forms of literature and even ceremony that tie them to a particular place and to particular other than humans in that place. Maybe I hate to say we, because who's we, right? But, maybe in today's fast-paced modern world, that's something we've lost. There's a beautiful book called Braiding Sweetgrass. I don't know if you've seen it. That's getting a lot of buzz these days, and it's by a Potawatomi biologist named Robin Wall Kimmerer. She'd actually be really interesting to interview on your podcast sometime. And there's a great chapter in that book where she talks about, so the book is largely about sustainability from an indigenous perspective. And she talks about the fact that, she says it's not that Western societies don't have ceremonies. They have things like birthday parties. They do have ceremonies that bring communities together, but they don't have ceremonies in the same ways that indigenous people had ceremonies where the entire community would go to the banks of a river for the salmon run, right? That's a very different kind of ritual and a very different relationality that is established with human kin and other than human kin, that is hard to replicate in, recycling prizes or whatever you're trying to use to motivate people to recycle or reduce their carbon footprint. I mean, I'm part of a gimmick now that is trying to get us to all commute to work on our bicycles. We're in, what rural New Hampshire is like. It's actually really hard to ride your bicycle 15 miles to work, when on narrow roads with no bike lanes and lots of hills.
In the winter,
and people don't want to log on to this different platform and make, get points. Like,
no.
There needs to be some other mechanism for getting humans to access the meaningful nature of that.
I think that there's a lot of wisdom in what you were saying about the rituals. There's this group of scholars that I actually work with pretty closely who try to promote what they call the Evolutionary Epic, which is basically using the evolution of life on Earth, but also the cosmos generally, as like a quote unquote naturalistic or scientific myth that could unite people, right? They want to sort of create some sort of environmental ethic out of wonder for what has taken place in the universe so far. And obviously, I tend to think that their ideas are pretty good, but they're also not at all embedded, right? They're not at all embedded in a culture. And ritual is so important for, when we look at cultures throughout the world. And we're kind of, like you said, our rituals today are pretty weird. You have like bar mitzvahs and weddings and funerals, but you don't have people gathering on the banks of a river. And that like really embeds you in a place and puts you in a relationship with it. And we just don't have that. And so I think part of the hesitancy that I've always felt about this evolutionary epic has actually been that it's too abstract, it's too amorphous. It's not actually something that is relational. And I think we need people to sort of experience that relationship, because once you do, like your friends, you take care of your friends. I would like walk down the hall to visit my friend if she were crying. I wouldn't need her to like sit next to me. Right. And so if you're actually in some sort of relationship, it's just a question of how to get or help people feel as though they're actually in relationship with the natural environment.
Right. Right. Because something like, gathering on the banks of a river for a salmon run even puts you in relationship with seasonal change. So the thing that a lot of scientists are looking now in New Hampshire is how climate change is affecting the seasons and ultimately our tourist dollars, right? I mean, the leaves are not turning the way that they used to, and the pond hockey, right? I mean, pond hockey, which was in a way a seasonal ritual that a lot of people around Lake Winnipesaukee enjoy, is getting truncated now because the lake is not freezing over the way it used to. So maybe, I don't know, is pond hockey our future? Like, no, probably not, because we're not going to have any ice.
We're not going to have any ice. I mean, you can like show people videos of polar bears standing on ice that's melting all day long. And we do that, and people do care for like a day or a week. But I think if you're not in a relationship with that polar bear that's dying, it's gonna get lost in the deluge of information and concerns that we have. Yeah. Wow. This is deep.
I don't know. It is deep. Is your podcast a way of, intervening in that? I'm thinking about the sustainability issue that's on my mind a lot lately, because I'm now chair of a department and I have to go meet parents of prospective students. And, the one question they always have is, what's my kid going to do with this degree in women's studies or English? And I know that the parents are up front asking this question, and you can see it so often. The student is behind, and the student wants 4 years of a meaningful life, right? And the student wants to read. The student wants to do art. The student wants to do music, and is frequently being told by the parents, it's not going to get you a job. So is something like creating this podcast an attempt to create a space for people to talk about what matters in a routinized way?
Yes.
It's turning the interview back on you, I realize.
Thank you. It's a few things. want to be able to, I'm trying very hard to have conversations that are stimulating and both broad and deep. And I'm very interdisciplinary. And so I am, and I have actually been able to, now that I have done several dozen of these, I am seeing sort of interconnected threads in various fields, in psychology and here in, literature and all that sort of stuff. And I think that that's really important because a lot of those conversations aren't happening. And so that's a piece. And also, I just so strongly believe that we need to do a lot of things in public culture. And I have been in the academy long enough, and we need more people sort of building bridges or breaking down the walls of the academy and taking these conversations that we're having and making them public, and also doing it in a way that's effective. Like, it's so hard. Like, it's very hard to be effective because I want to have nuance, but people don't love nuance, right? And so, but I'm committed to it, and I think I have the tools necessary to try and make open-mindedness and nuance and care sexy, maybe for the first time, right? Because I wouldn't say make it sexy again, because I don't know when it was, Aristotle or Plato, but yeah, I think it's really important that we try to sort of branch to have great discussions and then make them as accessible and engaging as possible. I can't promise that I'm really engaging all the time. My poor listeners, I do my best. Thank you all very much for your patience. But yeah, I think it's important. Unfortunately, the world is so massive. You have to pick your little piece that you're going to chip away at. And I find that very heartbreaking, and I'm probably trying to make my piece bigger than I should. But it's hard, and there's this Christian theologian named Reinhold Niebuhr. I don't know. There's this quote that he has about you can't, it's beautiful and it's several sentences long, but it ends with anything good cannot be accomplished in one lifetime. And therefore you must be saved by love or whatever, by working together. So
that's beautiful.
Yeah.
And actually, I think it's one thing I have taken away from reading so much Native American literature, but also talking to Native American communities and seeing how they have preserved their own literature and their own literary traditions with or without the help of major libraries, collecting institutions, or even the academy. So
right.
I actually, I don't think I will see the end of the humanities in my lifetime, but I sincerely worry. A lot of us worry about it, right? A lot of us worry that the humanities are being downsized, to just sort of this ancillary skill set for business people and engineers. But whatever happens in the academy, people are going to keep writing. People are going to keep writing. People are going to keep sharing their writing. People are going to keep saving their writing and preserving their writing and talking about their writing. And if, the particular institutional forms that I have personally cherished, for doing all of those things evaporate, literary art won't. So that's kind of a hopeful thing, I think.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. And I also, I do really believe that as flawed and horrible, wretchedly horrible we can be as a species, I don't think we would have made it, the last 12,000 years if we weren't at least slightly more good and slightly more caring and slightly more cooperative than we are bad. Maybe it's 52-48, but I do think that's real.
We have resilience.
Yes. And unfortunately, I think our best selves come out when we're in our crisis. When we're in crisis. And so
not until we're in pain, right? Not until do our best selves come out, right?
Yeah. So anyway, it's probably forthcoming. Okay, I'm ready. Okay, so we're kind of coming up on time. Do you have anything that you would like to sort of reflect on? Would you have any ideas lingering before we go?
I always want to talk about academic labor, but we don't have to talk about that because that's depressing. I guess the other,
let's talk about it.
Well, let's talk about it.
Let's go. Here we go.
From a stewardship standpoint,
mm-hmm.
I feel like we need to be training people. We need to be training people to care, right? About ideas in your field, about texts in my field, about art. And I really, with what has happened in the academic job market, I worry about generations of scholarship that has already been lost.
Mm-hmm.
I worry about the exploitation of human beings in fields that are supposed to be humanistic.
Mm.
This kind of sounds like it's in contradiction to what I said earlier, that, even if the academy totally collapses, there will still be people who care and do it.
Right.
But, that doesn't mean it's not painful to watch and that it's not incredibly bothersome to see.
Yeah,
the academy as it's currently constructed is unsustainable, right?
Talk about a theme of sustainability. Yeah, it really is. Something is going to give soon. I don't know what that is, or maybe it will be a long time and people will continue to be, radically overworked and underpaid.
Yeah.
But who knows? Maybe people will enroll in college less, maybe the demand for that. I don't know. The landscape changes so quickly. Maybe we'll have artificial intelligence and nobody will have to go to school again ever. But even then, right? Even in that instance, the humanities would remain relevant. And I think that they will remain relevant in large part because critical discourse has been so important to our political landscape recently. I don't see the humanities going away because I see them being advantageous to certain people's political agendas, probably, which is the only reason things survive, right? Things survive when they serve people's power. Unfortunately, I think the humanities, at least in some sense, the feminist discourses and the the colonialist discourses have been very important. Those have all come out of the humanities. Right. And so I think that torch will be carried forward, even if it's again under unideal conditions.
Yeah.
Don't know. More on which anon, I suppose. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Siobhan.
Thank you for having me, Stephanie. I love your podcast.
Thank you. Me too.
Right? It's public humanities. It's public humanities, and I love it.
Yeah, I'm trying. Okay. Thank you. What is the anthology called again that you have published?
It's called Dawnland Voices. It's in a book form. That's massive. It's 700 pages.
Wow.
Available on a nefarious online bookseller near you, or your local bookstore can order it. And then there's also an evolving, is it sustainable? An evolving online literary magazine, dawnlandvoices.org, that we continue to use to amplify the original book anthology.
Wow, that's a lot. That's a lot of resources. I've actually been to that website and read some of the blogs, and it was actually really, really great. So I do recommend it. Yeah. Okay, cool. So do check out those things. I'll put some links in the show notes. And thank you again, Siobhan, and thank you everybody for tuning in. You know where to find me. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I'm everywhere because that's the world today. So thanks again, and I'll talk to you next week.